As a channel that discusses mostly right-wing political movements and parties, to call something anti-Semitic constructs a fairly vivid picture of what I am referring to. Jewish plans of white racial genocide, the whethers or nots of the Holocaust, the media monopoly, the chosen people, I could go on. When John Tyndall of the BNP referred to Jews as like a parasite feeding on the rotting corpse of the nation, we can pretty easily situate that in broader extreme right ideology, an alien people working behind the scenes to subvert the integrity of the nation. The issue isn't whether such claims can be substantiated or not. The point is that when someone utters such things, we can, mostly, situate them appropriately politically. It has a sort of predictive value of other political beliefs, and is but a piece in a broader ideological framework. But this can create the false image that anti-Semitism, a term I will later go on to problematize, is an exclusively far-right phenomenon. As David Rich wishes to bring to our attention in his work The Left's Jewish Problem, this is not so. Rich attempts to demonstrate that there has always been a latent anti-Semitic, or rather problematic at least, conceptualization of Jews or Israel or Zionism on the left that needs analysis. The problem for Rich is that when the accusation of anti-Semitism is levelled at left-wing activists, they are unable to conceptualize an anti-Semitism within a left-wing framework. "But I have been an anti-racist all of my life," the accused may decry. "How could I possibly be accused of anti-Semitism?" Thus, a broader understanding of anti-Semitism is required that exists separate to the far-right tradition, and instead can be seen as a small but still problematic and constituent part of left-wing thought. The Soviet Union for Rich was an early source of modern left-wing anti-Semitism. Despite the Soviets initially backing the formation of the State of Israel and arming them back in 1948. Indeed, at one point the official Soviet line was that the birth of a Jewish state in the region marked the national liberation movement, obviously for pragmatic reasons rather than ideological affinity. As the Soviets aligned closer with Arab nations, relations with Israel turned sour. The British Empire was entering its decline, and newly formed post-colonial nations began positioning themselves in explicitly anti-colonial ways. The British left, becoming increasingly disillusioned with both the West's and the Soviets' increasingly militarized tactics, took up Third Worldism, the belief that the revolution was going to come not from the Western working classes, but instead from the working classes of the Third World rising up and toppling the global order. This led to an emphasis on anti-racist struggle, and a rejection of what came to be seen as colonial survivals that needed to be liberated. One obvious example here is Israel, but more notable throughout the late 60s and early 70s was activism against apartheid in South Africa. The point was, the beneficiaries of colonialism and empire by definition could not be revolutionary. Thus, a new working class was sought. South Africa was the natural rallying cry for New Left groups. Rich nicely dissects and analyses the ways in which old New Left activist networks taking action against apartheid later regrouped and reformulated their arguments against Israel. Even the PLO, who formed in 1964, were quick to use New Left rhetoric, and by 1965, drawing comparisons between Rhodesia, South Africa and Israel. A leaflet published that year read, "Nowhere in Asia or Africa, not even in South Africa or Rhodesia, has European race supremacism expressed itself in so passionate a zeal for thoroughgoing racial exclusiveness as it has in Palestine." This was a time at the height of Arab nationalism, with the most notable proponent being Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. Usually with some Soviet backing, or at least under-the-table encouragement, numerous groups emerged that enabled New Left intellectuals and Third Worldist activists to discuss the issues of the day, and led to some degree of ideological exchange. One early example was the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, who saw the issues of Vietnam, South Africa, Rhodesia and Israel as part of the same anti-colonial struggle. Key proponents of this view in Britain about the time were the Young Liberals, the youth wing of the mainstream Liberal Party, now known as the Liberal Democrats, who attended the First International Congress of Solidarity with the People of Palestine in 1969. It was here that Israel was presented as a key bastion of imperialist and capitalist expansionism, headed by the United States, and it was through said exchanges that these ideas entered British leftist thought. One thing that should be taken of note here is how these Arab leaders and British leftists never framed the Palestinian question in Islamic terms. Instead, fighting Israel was a constituent part of left-wing anti-colonial struggle. Arafat and his PLO in Palestine used explicitly third worldist and anti-capitalist rhetoric, and seldom invoked any religious sentiment at all. Indeed, Fatah, an often violent and large faction of the PLO, even named its military operations and fighting units after individuals they drew inspiration from, such as Che Guevara and Ho Chi Minh. Thus, pan-Arabists and new leftists were often reading from the same hymn sheet. Broad coalitions were viable as, by and large, their ends, or at least the theoretical framework they were drawing from, were mutual. One example would be the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Launched in 1969, it was an amalgamation of a hodgepodge of groups, from Maoists to Trotskyists to socialists to Arab nationalists. Indeed, its HQ was in the Egyptian embassy and, unsurprisingly, had Arab nationalists at the fore, often aligned with the violent Fatah. This isn't to say that there were no other strands of thought. Some Marxist groups wanted no alignment with pan-Arabist groups. Fatah was thus out of the question, and instead those thusly ideologically minded aligned with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist faction of the PLO. So then it shouldn't be ignored that when we speak of the New Left, we're speaking in generally broad ideological brushstrokes, and of course there was heterogeneity within the movement itself. So then, we have Zionism itself being linked with colonialism and European racism. Dismantling Zionism became part and parcel of anti-racist activism. Eventually, this link became totally vindicated by the United Nations, when the General Assembly passed a resolution positing Zionism to be racist in 1975. This passing wasn't so shocking considering the heavy presence of Soviet allied states and Arab nationalists in the General Assembly. This was coupled with previous resolutions explicitly linking Zionism with the regimes of Rhodesia and South Africa. The year prior, the National Union of Students in the UK passed a resolution officially no platforming racists, and so it became. No platforming Zionism became a cornerstone of anti-racist practice. This led to an increasingly hostile environment for many Jews on university campuses. Jewish student union organizations often were put under increasing pressure, disbanded, or in rare cases were outright banned under the auspices of anti-racism. This was never framed in terms of a rejection of Jewishness per se, but instead anti-Zionism. The thing is, according to research conducted by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in 2010, 95% of British Jews report Israel as having some role in their Jewish identity. So the question arises, how can the two be disentangled? How can anti-Zionism not be an attack on a fundamental Jewish identity? Moreover, it cannot be denied that blatant anti-Semitism was and is often camouflaged in anti-Zionist anti-racism, and often there was and is a considerable degree of overlap between legitimate racism against Jewishness in general and criticism of Israel. The BAZO, or the British Anti-Zionist Organisation, were a case in point. The organisation seems likely to have had connections with Iraqi Baathism due to its tightly knit association with the National Union of Iraqi Students, which was itself banned in 1979 and was banned by the National Union of Students during the 1980s for overt anti-Semitism in its leaflets. Nevertheless, the organisation had considerable influence. Indeed, one notable George Galloway passed through their ranks and credits a trip to the Middle East with the BAZO as a formative moment for his anti-Zionism. This isn't to label Galloway an extreme anti-Semite, but it is to illustrate the muddy waters and overlap between groups. This cannot be more obvious than today. Now, instead of new leftist groups aligning with Arab nationalism, it is Islamism, an ideology that doesn't generally see Zionism as a political problem, but rather a religious one. Arab nationalism was a socially conservative ideology, as remarked upon before, but some left-wing groupuscules found such an allegiance problematic and found other more non-nationalistic groups to align with. Today, though, it is increasingly difficult to find new left voices with any clout openly calling out Islamist groups for views that many would consider problematic. Corbyn is able to refer to Hamas as a friend and regard their designation as a terrorist group a mistake, without a significant backlash from ideological peers. Judith Butler, considered by many to be one of the founding theoreticians of third-wave feminism and queer theory, has stressed the importance of understanding Hamas as a progressive movement and part of a global left. Much of this stems from how Arab nationalism faltered throughout the late 60s and 70s, and in line with the rise of identity politics throughout Western Europe and other circumstances throughout the world, the rise of Islamism. Islamists traditionally remained somewhat suspicious of left-wing activism in the UK, but then found joint cause for mobilisation around the Stop the War coalition, which became synonymous with anti-Zionism. Is it fair, though, to assume that the anti-Jewish rhetoric of, say, Hamas, which draws from old-school and identifiable anti-Semitism, such as the Protocols of Zion, and the anti-Zionist rhetoric of the left are equivalents? What about the term anti-Semitism in general, which draws equivalency between a far-right set of ideas, which envisage Jews as deterministically incompatible, subversive and alien to the nation, and now also criticism of Zionism? Again, to me it seems like we are referring to a different set of phenomena here, even if there sometimes can be a degree of overlap between the two, and one can often draw on the other for legitimacy. Numerous conceptions of this second wave of anti-Semitism exist, whether it be a ubiquitously existent undercurrent of public life that bubbles to the surface at certain trigger points of history, or instead a ruse utilised by Zionist groups to deflect criticism of the State of Israel. Nevertheless, it is normally considered to focus around the State of Israel and the question of its legitimacy. As far back as 1973, Israeli Foreign Minister Eba Eban posited, "The new anti-Semitism says that the right to establish and maintain an independent national sovereign state is the prerogative of all nations, as long as they happen not to be Jewish." Problem with this conception is the left's general view of the solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is basically unresolved. Are they in favour of a two-state solution? A single-state solution? What would the single state look like? Would it be Islamic in the vision of Hamas, or would it be secular and democratic? Is one of these positions more or less anti-Semitic than the other? Why would a single democratic state be anti-Semitic, provided the rights of all peoples within it were guaranteed? Again, I'm not saying Jewish people have no legitimate grievances with individuals claiming Jewishness as the basis for a state is unfounded, but I am calling into question whether anti-Semitism is a useful term in labelling it here. The left doesn't exist in a vacuum, nor is the left a homogeneous thing that we can easily separate from other ideological trends. There has been a significant overlap between the new left, Arab nationalism, Soviet communism, Third Worldism, even Islamism to some degree. Alliances between the left and Islamist groups that patently do draw from old-school anti-Semitic narratives understandably cause ire, and in some cases legitimate danger for Jewish communities. Even so, we are still left without avenues to criticise policies of Israel or even foundational tenets of the state's identity without possibly animating the spectre of anti-Semitism, whether the ghost is real or imagined. Thing is, it seems destined to remain an argument without an answer. Many legitimate anti-Semites can use anti-Zionism as a cloak for their anti-Semitism. Criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitic. The charge of anti-Semitism becomes conceived of as a way to delegitimize criticism of Israel. And so the cycle continues and seems destined to continue indefinitely. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you liked the video, don't forget to click like and please do subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't click dislike, leave a comment, tell me where I went wrong. As always, huge thank you to all my Patreons. It's thanks to you guys that these videos remain regular. As always, if it's within your means to do so and you like what I do, please do consider becoming a patron yourself. As always, thanks a lot for watching again, and until next time.